Hello, welcome to the Hell Project. My name's Phil. We'll be talking with my guest Luke Wilson in a moment about church fathers and hell. If you have no idea what this channel is about, it's about hell. It's about a particular view of hell called conditional immortality. I summarize it with the phrase that without Jesus, we're all dead, that our immortality is conditional on faith in Christ, and that without Christ we do not gain access to immortality. So that's kind of the overview. We'll be talking to Luke about his journey into this view, but we'll also be focusing on his journey through the Church Fathers and a book that he's written as well, and just having a conversation about all those things all together. And it is a conversation, but if you are watching live and want to ask us a question, we will engage with it as best we can and hopefully have an answer for you. If not, we will share some resources that we found helpful, and hopefully that will set you on your journey to engaging well with the Church Fathers. So without any further ado, I'm going to bring Luke on the screen. Welcome, Luke.
Hello. Thanks
for joining in. The first Hell Project live stream with a guest for the best part of a year. So it's nice to be back. And Luke, tell us a little bit about yourself. What do you do? And start there. Why are you a Christian? A small question.
Oh yeah. That's a
sorry, I didn't even
more question to start with.
Start with the early thing. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Back in 1985, so I don't know how to. I guess now I'm an Anglican. Now I guess I would say I'm a discerning ordination, so I probably should claim that title. I'm potentially be a vicar one day.
Nice.
And I like to read lots of ancient texts for fun and write stuff about them for other people who hopefully find it interesting. And I write, I read, I go to church.
Nice. And then what do you do for a job?
I do tech things. It's
right.
Project management.
Okay.
Coding.
And so is the stuff you do with like Church Fathers and that kind of thing, is that more of your sort of your fun, your free time?
Yeah.
Right.
As odd as that might sound. But
no, I get it. I get it. I'm totally the same. It's like it is my escape to dig into
tell people like read academic books for fun. I'm like, well, yes.
Yeah.
Yes, I do.
Yeah, there's some of us out here, and most of us are on the internet.
Yeah.
So we're digging into it.
Find our community.
Yeah, that's it. Well, I share the sort of tentative Anglican badge myself now these days. I'm also attending an local Anglican church, and so far it's going okay. Although there's obviously, we won't get into the background of the Anglican Church too much today. So tell me a little bit. I did make a joke that I wanted to hear about why you're a Christian, but I guess more, where did you start in your Christian faith in terms of in relation to the doctrine of hell, as that's the channel? Let's start there. What's your journey been through that?
That probably started, I was in a youth group many moons ago. I'm trying to think what year it was now. Early 2000s. 2004, I would have guessed.
Okay.
Around that time. And, the standard thing was just eternal conscious torment. That was what was taught. I was...
Right, if he says hello.
Oh, hey. No chill, Bill.
Well, welcome those who joined us live. Just hearing Luke's starting point for his journey through hell.
Yeah.
turning into the view that he holds now.
Yeah, my own harrowing of hell.
We've all been there.
Yeah, so yeah, probably early 2000s. I was in a youth group. I'd really only just become, I'd say, properly Christian. I mean, I grew up in a Christian home, but I was, without getting into all the nitty gritties of my own, whatever, being saved story. That was around the time I joined a proper church, had youth group, actually met teenagers my own age who were Christians as well, which was, a novelty to me. I'd grown up in a very small village Anglican church until that point, in a middle of nowhere kind of thing. So realizing there was kids my own age and a youth group discovering Christian music, I was like, there's a whole new world.
That is a whole new world.
So, yeah. But around that time, a friend of mine was really questioning like the ethics of hell, I guess, the morality of it. Like, how can God send people to burn forever? That kind of typical question. And I didn't have an answer to it.
Yep.
And but it got me really wanting to look at it because eventually this person sort of lost their faith. I think that was sort of the starting point of that, maybe.
Mm-hmm. It's a big one for many.
That kind of thing. Yeah. So that whole question couldn't be resolved, and I think that just pushed them away. So, but it pushed me and a friend to sort of dig into that and go, we need to have an answer for this, because we just realized at that sort of point when you realize that you accept things because that's the only thing you've been told, you never really thought about it properly. So I was like, oh, is this right? Is it the only way of thinking about things, etc.? Yeah. It's around the time that Rob Bell brought out his book, Love Wins.
Oh yeah, I remember that came out and all the stir it caused.
Yeah, so I got that, I read that, and it was actually very timely. The questions he was asking in the book was all the kind of questions I was asking and thinking about. And even though I was like, oh, Rob Bell's a universalist, blah blah, kind of thing.
But he never fully comes out as universalist in that book, does he? He asks a lot of questions.
Yeah, exactly. He asks all the questions. He leaves it open-ended at the end to sort of ponder on yourself and think about. So I think it was just the implication that it isn't only eternal conscious torment. I think he was obviously pointing towards a more sort of universalist or universal reconciliation sort of view.
Yeah.
But he doesn't really come out and say it. But the questions in the book was everything I was thinking at the time and asking myself. So I found it quite helpful just to be like, oh, that's a good place to start. And, kicked off this journey, which sort of went on and off for a long time. I dug into it, then I didn't. I left it for a while and always kept coming back to it. So eventually I got down to it. When was it? A while ago now.
Yeah, and your guest blog was probably around 2020, I think, or 2019, 2020, when and I'd only been, so I started this channel in 2019, sort of on and off, studying before that. But it is a slow burn, pun intended, slow burn of just I think I remember Love Wins coming out, and I pretty well read that, and I wasn't really sure what the fuss was in many ways. But I think the fuss around Love Wins basically is like a picture of the general response most people have to hell when it's questioned, and why so many people don't bother thinking it through. And if you're going to
the golden calf of
evangelicalism. And it absolutely is. I mean, I was that person that when I was talking to my mate, I saw the book Rethinking Hell on his bookcase, and my first instinct was to call him a heretic. Like it was jokey, but at the same time, that is a picture of like, oh, you can't question this. To question people burning forever is the like, puts you in danger of
questioning
burning.
God, almost, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's a weird one, but yeah. So you heard Love Wins coming and out, and I guess
I got Francis Chan's response to that. That was Erasing Hell, which I never actually read properly. Someone else read it. A friend of mine said it was.
Yeah, it's a bit like that. It's a bit
it wasn't the best response. I think it was described as a very pat answer of evangelical thought.
They didn't touch on the Old Testament at all, and it was it's the first time I've ever read anything by Preston Sprinkle when I read Erasing Hell.
Isn't he now?
And he's now he now holds to conditionalism, and you can find he did a very good talk
really.
at Rethinking Hell conference. But I guess the studies in that book spurred him onwards. One thing that about Erasing Hell was they were actually, we're talking about the debate around hell. They were very kind towards annihilation, but they were very flippant about dismissing it. Like it was just like, there's this sort of thing over here called annihilation, which has some scriptural backing, but they're wrong. And it kind of moves on. And I read Erasing Hell when I was already on the path to conditionalism. I've been part of the Rethinking Hell group for a little while, and it was just well, if this is a response to Love Wins, I should probably read it. It's an easy read, but they do the
it looked like it. It's just I never got around to it.
I wouldn't.
There's other things on that shelf behind me.
There are other things to read. So going on from that, what started you towards actually changing your mind?
Well, I just sat down and decided to make time to do the study, go through the scriptures, all the things I've been reading over the years that have put those sort of questions or answers or more questions into my head of there's more to this, and different ways to look at understanding of the fire and the Old Testament and things like that. And then with things like the Malachi verses of being like a silversmith kind of thing, burning out, God's like a refining fire rather than destructive fire and things like that. And you're just there's a lot more going on here than the simple sort of views you normally get. Of Jesus, the old trope of Jesus speaks more about hell than anything else. And you actually even just going through as a very basic sense of doing a word count of the words hell or Gehenna or whatever, you're just actually that's not said as often as people tell you.
I know. I find, and that's probably where I get the most frustrated in this conversation is when people who should know better, who have big platforms, share things like that. I mean, Mark Driscoll did it the other day on a TikTok channel. I mean, it's just crazy to me that someone who's been for whatever you think about Mark Driscoll, he has a decent memory and he's able to quote scripture fairly well. And at one point in his career, people thought he was decent at least some form of hermeneutic. But for him to just say that comment that Jesus spoke more of hell than anyone, as if that's
it's been repeated so often that everyone just thinks it's fact now. They don't need to look into it. It's if so and so says it, then it must be true. It's almost got to that sort of level.
I think it has. I mean, we see that with the maggots will eat you and you'll still be alive. I mean, that trope's been, thanks Dante. It's kind of.
Well, I mean, that was the other thing. Just realizing that a lot of the imagery of hell comes from more like Renaissance artwork than actual scripture, and Dante's Inferno actually helped solidify a lot of that in sort of cultural consciousness, if you like. For centuries now. So it's just there's just so much to unpack. You can't just be it's this because that's the plain reading of the Bible, blah de da. And you're well, actually, there's so many layers of historical influence that's layering your own understanding that you're just blind to half the time until you sort of realize it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's similar for me. I mean, the kicker for me was just literally being asked, what does perish mean? And I was like, I can't in any other context make that mean alive in torment. It doesn't work anywhere, but suddenly there's the magical Christian language that makes hell what it is. It's fascinating how it's become like that.
I think for me it was Romans. The wages of sin is death, and it's like suddenly death means something else when it's talking about hell or afterlife. But in any other case, it's just normal.
Yes.
Normal death.
Yeah.
It's like
Yeah.
same with that sort of perish. Any other place that perish is used in the scriptures, it means just normal destruction, end of something. Until it's talking about people, and suddenly it's eternally perishing but still alive kind of thing. You're like,
it's a framework that I still don't think I've fully unpacked it, even after the amount of studies that I've done. But it's the framework of the sort of spiritual versus physical death that kind of wraps itself around the doctrine of hell, so that when you read the language of Romans talking about the wages of sin is death, you read, oh, that must mean spiritual death, like this kind of, that can't mean your soul is dead because the soul doesn't die, even though there's scriptures that kind of very clearly say that. But
that's the other thing. It's everyone works on the assumption that your soul is immortal, or that we are immortal inherently. And I think once you've got to sort of drill down quite a lot through a lot of layers of things, of like not just death and fire and all those meanings, but then to like what we assume is our base sort of, I don't know, core of our actual being. And if we start with the assumption, oh, we're immortal, then everything else has to fit into that sort of understanding. But I think, I guess the main realization for me was like going, but are we? I mean, there's not really anything that says we are, except in the context of as a reward for being in Christ. So like, why are we rewarded with immortality if we're already immortal? I mean, that's suddenly it starts to break down, and you're just like, this doesn't make sense anymore when you start putting everything together rather than just the choice bits that make the doctrine make sense.
Amen. Preach. And it is totally that, and I think that's also what makes sometimes it quite difficult to introduce someone to conditionalism, because there's so many
to unpack first.
Various bits. You're talking about the soul, you're talking about immortality, you're talking about history of the church, talking about Dante, you're talking about culture, and
apocalyptic imagery, because you got to suddenly get around whether they think that's all literal and try and explain that actually it's more symbolism. It's not necessarily hard and fast literal, wooden literalism. It's you've got to unlearn a lot before you can even start.
Absolutely.
And that's what I went into this doing. I was like, right, I'm going to scrap everything I thought I knew, start fresh, and just read the Bible as it comes and try and understand it sort of in its context, the words, what they mean, without the sort of overarching implications or in the back of my mind of whatever I thought this should mean from previous understanding, and sort of try to go to the blank fresh slate and just go out, work my way outwards and see where I end up. I thought if I end up in eternal conscious torment still, then great, at least I know why I landed there. But if I don't, then at least I'll understand how I got there and why I think that's more likely. And I went in with ECT and came up with a CI.
Was universalism ever on the cards when you did that? Was that kind of, did you find anything?
Like universal reconciliation, I would call it, to sort of distinguish from, I guess, what I call like secular universalism, which is the idea that
all roads lead to heaven.
All roads, everything goes to heaven, and all things go to God. There's nothing, no barriers, no judgment, whatever. So I'd separate that sort of universalism as like secular understanding, and call universal reconciliation the sort of historic Christian view of what people who have held to that, in that there is still like the resurrection, a judgment, and whatever, but it's more down to that sort of refining fire than a destructive fire or eternally burning fire.
Yeah.
So I think there's places that sort of lend to that idea. And I guess I'd say I'm more of a hopeful universalist in that sense.
Right.
Like, it would be nice if that is the outcome.
Mm-hmm.
But from the scriptures and the way I understand it, from my studies, I wouldn't be able to say 100%,
that I'm there.
Yes, that's, yeah.
Yeah, it is an interesting one, that, because I'm not quite sure. Like, I'm definitely leaning inclusivist in the sense that there is a common grace and space for those who have not heard, those who have, like, sin has created such a barrier that they are not able to access Christ. Like, that's kind of in this life. There is provable that people have died without ever hearing the gospel this side of the death and resurrection of Christ. How do we handle that? How do we handle those who are so deep within Islamic or other religious countries? All they have is the conscience within them and a desperate heart to seek God and love their neighbor, and they don't know that it's God's grace within them, but that's how they've lived. Like, there's room for that, I think, within the scope of the text of the scriptures. Though it's, I would. That's where I would read those texts of, like, that are more universalist. I would use them. I'd call it an inclusive lens and it's still something I'm unpacking, but I just find the language that there will be some who are destroyed so clear.
It's too strong. Yeah, that's my problem. It's like, well, I would say my problem, but like, I can't go that far because there's other things that are too clear about ultimate destruction.
Yeah.
But like you're saying, people who don't know, like, 100% capacity, they've never had the chance to hear the gospel properly or at all, then I put it down to, like, God's mercy is obviously far greater and wider than we can ever comprehend. So I trust that there is scope in the love of God for that he isn't just, like a binary machine of God. Like, you come to the pearly gates and he's like, did you know the gospel? Nope. Pull the lever down to hell.
That's it. Yeah.
Sorry, my hands are tied. But you made the rules.
Yep.
Nope. So,
and we have to contend with the preaching that does the historic preaching. I think it might be Jonathan Edwards, or there are other Puritan preachers out there that were very clearly talking about children of other faiths who would be tormented forever, and that would be justified. And as Christians, we have to acknowledge that the people that have come before us, obviously there's a bigger conversation around the Bible and the canon, but church fathers onwards, we need to accept that these are flawed people coming to the scriptures just like us. And those elements within the preachers that are just horrendous, we can call them out and say, look, they got that wrong, and that is a horrendous thing to preach, and we must repent, I guess, if that's what we have to do. But if that's what we've been teaching in the past ourselves, I remember a side note. I went to a Christian school overseas, and I remember having to do a PowerPoint presentation, learning PowerPoint in the computing studies lesson. And I remember I hadn't even, I don't think, read Jonathan Edwards' Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. I'd never read it, but for some reason the imagery had somehow got on my mind. And I remember doing a PowerPoint presentation.
I've never read it either.
Yeah, I just had this image in my mind, and I don't know if you're a similar age to me. The PowerPoint, the sort of clip art stick figures that you could break apart and you could animate. You could do those little PowerPoint. I actually made one that basically reflected Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God and had little clip art figures hanging over fire. I mean, I was like, what was I then? 14, thinking that that's biblical and also a good thing to make a PowerPoint presentation about. Like, it's just crazy. I can't remember the grade I got, but no one was like, Phil, stop with that grotesque imagery.
That's the thing. It's just sort of almost universally accepted that that is the default position and there's no other option. And
yeah,
however uncomfortable it might make you, you just have to go. Guess that's that.
it's God. It's beyond our understanding.
Yeah.
So yeah. Oh, and
Question hell, you're questioning God. How dare you, kind of thing.
Yep. Yeah. It's definitely that. So going on from that, just trying to. I just totally derailed my train of thought with that PowerPoint presentation questions comment just stuck in my mind. So I guess how long would you like? Has it been a couple of years now since you've been like, yeah, okay, conditional immortality is probably.
Yeah, I'm looking at when I first wrote my blog, like digging into the whole thing. 25th of May 2020 when I published that. So that's sort of when I came to some sort of clearer understanding, I guess, to actually write about it. But it was, almost a decade in the making.
Yeah.
So yeah, so what do you say, the slow burn.
It is. I found that when I started, so there was probably a good couple of years where I was part of the Rethinking Hell group. I was just kind of absorbing stuff. I've got a Google Keep note with all the verses as people were sharing them of like, oh, that one, yeah, that definitely doesn't sound like eternal torment. Oh, that doesn't sound like eternal. That sounds more like death.
I've got folders and notes of similar stuff.
And then when it came to actually writing, you're suddenly just like, here's all that couple of years just on paper. And
that's part of why it probably took a while to write it, because I was overwhelmed with the research I'd gathered. And just like, I've got to sit down and try and put all this together now. Why do I do this to myself?
Well, at least you got something to write about.
Can't I just be like content that I know it now? Why don't I have to write about it? But I'm compelled to write. So
I get that vibe. So pausing on the conversation from El slightly, just to comment that Marguerite in the comments has asked us about the second death in Revelation 2:11. I was going to go straight into talking about the church fathers, but actually let's pause on that for a second. So could you explain Revelation 2:11, the last part, the second death? Do you have, from your research and how would you describe the second death now? I can read it for those who are not as quick on there. I've pulled out my phone earlier. So whoever has ears, let them hear what the Spirit says to the churches. The one who is victorious will not be hurt at all by the second death. The context being the first couple. So Revelation 1, you've got the vision of Jesus. Revelation 2 and 3, you've got the letters to the 7 churches. This is in the particular letter to the church of Smyrna, who's said to have been known for their afflictions and their poverty. Then there's they're being slandered, persecuted, but an encouragement that to basically suffer well and persevere through the suffering. And then this verse comes in the conclusion of that the one who is victorious will not be hurt at all by the second death. So you got thoughts on that, Luke?
Yeah, I was thinking of Revelation 20 where it's described more. I was forgetting that it was mentioned earlier on as well. I guess looking at Revelation 20 gives a bit more detail on the second death and that whole idea of the smoke going up forever.
Mm-hmm.
I suppose there's two sort of approaches we can take here. One is that this is the book of Revelation. Everything is highly symbolic. It's apocalyptic imagery. It's hard to just decide which parts we pick and choose are literal and which parts are symbolic and which parts, are talking about the spiritual realm and not necessarily in like human physical ways that we might be able to grasp. And then also you've got the sort of symbolism side of that in terms of like contrasting that with like Isaiah 34 verses 9 and 10, which talks about Edom being turned to pitch, soil to sulfur, and all that kind of thing. And so day and night it won't be quenched, the smoke shall go up forever, which clearly isn't literal because Edom, or the area that place was, still exists today, and it's no longer burning. there's no smoke going up forever and ever. So does that mean the scriptures lie? They're mistaken? Or is this a phrase that is used to convey something else, a sort of permanent state of being, but not necessarily a literal state of being? If that makes sense.
Yeah. I'd agree with that. I think it's an interesting one, the second death, in terms of the fact that Revelation is the only book that uses the phrase. I like Chris Date has a good argument from Rethinking Hell in terms of pointing out that later on in Revelation 20, I was just trying to find it on my other screen here. So Revelation 20, it says and it says it in 21 as well. So right at the end of 20, it says, death and Hades were thrown into the lake of fire. This is the second death, the lake of fire. That's reading from the Net Bible, but most of the translations will have it quite fairly clearly, I think, that it's explaining that the lake of fire is the second death. It's not the other way around. So like the image is explained by the language, and you see that through other visions, and Chris Date will link to Joseph's visions and how they used a similar kind of structure. And then even in Revelation, a similar kind of structure for the second death is the explanation for the vision. And so we then have to discuss what death is. And I think that's where things get a bit convoluted for the eternal torment position. I know universalists will argue that the second death is the death of the old self and sin, and that's what's destroyed in the lake of fire. Ultimately, I think the universalists and the conditionists have the strongest arguments that there's destruction here, because we acknowledge the consistency that death and Hades are destroyed in the lake of fire. And all the traditionalists that I've read will acknowledge that the second death destroys death, as in it's the death of death. They will acknowledge that death will be no more. And yet, for some reason, when humans are thrown in, it's not the death of them anymore. It's the eternal conscious torment of them, which in a sense makes them alive.
Like we're more potent or powerful than death itself.
Yeah,
that we can survive
all immortal.
The lake of fire.
Yeah.
Surely death is more immortal than us, because death kills us. It's like it's inconsistent logic.
Yeah,
when
absolutely.
You sort of get down to it.
And I think with Revelation 2:11, it's almost making you want to ask the question, well, what is the second death? And then how does that play out throughout the rest? And I think the language of they won't be hurt by the second death is the fact that second death destroys, it kills, as we find that out as we read through Revelation to get to the end. And John doesn't explain it at all in the second chapter of his book. And I think he's expecting you to read the rest of the book to find out, well, what does he mean by the second death? I'm not clued into the contemporary literature of the time, and I think someone else uses second death around the similar time as him, but I can't remember that argument and what that means for the language. But I hope that helps, Marguerite, in terms of looking at arguments for this. In terms of digging into Revelation, there's loads of good commenters out there. I'd recommend to Ian Paul and Scott McKnight. Scott McKnight has one that's come out recently, and he argues that this is language for destruction and the death of death, the death of evil going on. So I hope that's helpful. We'll do follow-up question. We'll try and engage with that in a moment. So I've seen Spartan Theology in the chat has asked a question about the Church Fathers. So let's segue from the second death and Revelation into the Church Fathers. So just before we start talking about them, we haven't necessarily prepared as well as we'd hoped. Both of us have had fairly crazy weeks, so we might have to do a second part to this conversation. But before you begin, Luke, just what got you into the Church Fathers? Like how long have you been studying the Church Fathers, and why are you into them? what's the point?
That's a good question. It's one I often get asked, because people are just like, why do you care? Mainly started around 6 years ago. So it was just before my daughter was born. It's the easiest way I can remember it, because I wrote the first book just after she was born. Somehow I managed to publish a book with a small child. And the main sort of thrust of it came out of I was in a non-denominational church at the time, and I've been going there for like 10 years. And it just sort of got to that point where I just stood there one Sunday. It was just like, every week it's, we do like 2 songs, there's a sermon, some notices, 3 more songs, we're going to have coffee. Every now and again, it might be communion might be thrown in there every now and again. And it wasn't necessarily as reverent. It was just kind of placed and like, if you want to do it, you can come up and get it kind of thing. It wasn't sort of a focal point almost. Sometimes it was, sometimes it wasn't. It was just bread and juice was left at the front on the stage, and it was like, if you want to get it, get it. And it was just like, and even though I wasn't like sacramental in my thinking at that point, I had always suspected baptism and communion had more to it than just the basic pure symbolism view, just because of the way Paul talks about it in Corinthians, I think, where it's like, this is the reason some of you are sick and are dying, is because you've taken like communion unworthily. It's like, well,
interesting.
Symbolism doesn't kill you, so there's something more going on here. And like Peter's preaching is quite often through Acts, repent and be baptized for the forgiveness of your sins, like for the washing of your sins and things like that, and the washing of regeneration in Titus. So there's all these little hints of like more to these things, which always sort of maybe like I could never sort of put my finger on what it was, but it was always there in the back of my mind. So yeah, anyway, that's a tangent. So I was just stood in church one day, and it's just like, is this really all church is about? A couple of songs, sermon, go home, drink tea, kind of thing. I was like, I mean, obviously there's more to it than just that, but the week in, week out type of thing, I was just like, I was just bored, basically, and a bit disillusioned. And not the songs, it was contemporary songs, and I know I'm not against contemporary music in church, but some are terrible. Not all of them. Some are good. Just because they're contemporary doesn't mean they're automatically bad. And I do love some of them, but some are just, terrible. And you're just like,
very empty. And it's all about me.
I don't always like singing. It's not the way I sort of connect. I'm quite more contemplative, so I like.
That makes sense.
I like sort of contemplative prayer and sort of meditative, sort of quiet type retreat things. So singing is not necessarily always the way I connect in church. So when I don't like the songs, and I couldn't sort of connect with God in that sort of way, and I'm just stood there like, the song is terrible, the words are horrible, what is this teaching me? All you got left is a sermon for 20 minutes if you take songs out of the whole process. There's no sort of corporate prayer. And then if the sermon isn't, not to say it's not great, but if it's something you sort of already know, like, and it's always sort of been I always try and find something like in some whatever I'm listening to, because obviously you don't know everything. But when you have sort of studied theology, it's like degree level and things. Sometimes things are just like, okay, it's like the milk and meat type of thing. It's you want something a bit more depth. So when it's like, if you take music out, you sort of take a sermon out, or it's not that engaging for you. It's like, what are you left with? So this is my long way of saying that I decided to go back to the very beginning, and I was like, right, I'm going to go as far back in history as possible to sort of like the end of the New Testament and whatever came afterwards, and just read forwards and see, is this how we've always done it? And I've just got to suck it up and deal with it. Or are we missing something? Have we lost something along the way? A lot of the time I was brought up, I was told, like all the traditions of the church, like in like Catholic Church and whatever is the usual target, but those sort of liturgical sort of traditions and things is all medieval add-ons that corrupted the church in the medieval period. And the pure churches, house churches, and basically Baptist,
Yeah.
So it's like, well, let's see if that holds any weight, and went back in time, metaphorically speaking, and read everything I could in chronological order, as much as I could, and came out sacramental and Anglican. So
careful with reading the church fathers, I suppose.
Well, there's that famous quote. Is like, what's his name? I've forgotten his name. That famous quote is like, you can't read the church fathers and remain Protestant. And I'm like, well, yeah, you can.
I suppose Anglo-Catholic, Anglican can be fairly close to Catholic, depending on what kind of church you're in.
Do you like high church? I mean, the church I'm at is quite evangelical, but it's still liturgical.
Yeah.
Just not quite as smells and bells as some of the others. But
I think that's been so I have grown up in the sort of evangelical world and missionary field, and I'd say that throughout my secondary education, well, I don't think I really heard church fathers in the sense of something that could be read until I was at university. So that's growing up around Christians, Protestant Christians, generally from various denominations. Have been in Baptist, Anglican, different things. I'm sure someone's mentioned church fathers to me at some point, but really I'm only just engaging with them now. So I feel like I'm on such a back foot of church history, and obviously there's so much to be discussed. So even as I read them now, I think that we've done ourselves such a disservice as Protestants, but also as non-denominational churchgoers, and this has got to be surely part of the basic discipleship, that we're part of something bigger than us. But I've always heard that as that's what this congregation is. You're part of something bigger. But suddenly, having even just scratched the surface of the church fathers, it's like suddenly I'm part of this far bigger story that gets me closer to Jesus and the apostles than anything my non-denominational upbringing is really. And I don't.
Yeah, I suddenly felt rooted to something that went far beyond me and stretched, millennia back. I was suddenly just like, no, I am part of, the history of faith doesn't start when the church I'm part of was founded. It's like a decade ago or whatever.
Yeah,
it's far beyond us, and we have got a heritage that has been lost.
Yeah. It's just got in my head. There's a cartoon that's out there of a guy standing by a board, and it's got all the branches of denominations from the apostles.
I know which one you mean.
See it, and the guy's like, "And here we are at the end. This is where we got things right." And there's this one branch, and then
the guy's like, "Jesus is so lucky to have us."
That's the one. Jesus is so lucky to have us. So it's brilliant, and I guess the thing that I've noticed the most in terms of the early start with the church fathers is the focus on things. I think what we have missed in the church these days, and this is a slight aside from the topic, we will talk about church fathers and hell in a moment, but the absence of a fiery torment language, that's like totally missing from the first early fathers. They used the scriptural language of fire and death. But in terms of an idea of someone being in torments forever, it's not there in at least where I'm up to, which admittedly isn't very far. I think I'm still in Irenaeus, but it's missing. It's just not there. And the other aspect is that the emphasis on Christ's body and the bodily resurrection, it's quite clear the sort of heresies they're dealing with early on, that it's a spiritual resurrection and he didn't really rise. And ultimately, this humility, the focus on humility as part of the Christian life, I just find fascinating. And I don't know when the last time I heard a sermon on humility within the church as part of a discipleship. I don't know about you. I haven't had a sermon on that for. If you're watching,
no.
have you had a sermon on what it means to be humble as a Christian? And be interested to know. So, moving on then to your reading of the Church Fathers and connecting it to the topic at hand and God's judgment, where, first off, there is this concept that at least traditionists would argue that it's always been eternal torment is the go-to position, the default, that even Jesus was, obviously. So like, is that true at the time of the earliest Church Fathers? Is it one view predominantly, or what have you found?
There's very rarely ever a predominant view, I think, at any time in history. I mean, there's obviously some that are more popular, but there's never really been a sort of, this is the way we believe, in the sort of way that like the Nicene Creed has been formulated around core aspects of belief in Jesus and his deity and nature and all that kind of things. There's never been a sort of ecumenical council or creed built around hell. It's just, like you say, some of the earliest texts, they just use the language of the scripture almost in an open-ended way. It's almost like, they quote the words of scripture and you just sort of expect it to either understand what they mean or build your own assumptions of what they mean, I guess.
Yeah. And fill in the gaps. This is eternal fire, and this is what Jesus said is eternal fire, but he doesn't. Yeah.
Or there's that sort of context we miss, in that people from that earliest times were still within that sort of culture and language that spoke and wrote these ways.
Mm-hmm.
So possibly had that sort of innate understanding of what that meant without having to spell it out for people that they were writing to. In the same way that if we wrote to someone today about, I don't know, a standard practice in society, we wouldn't explain it step by step what that means, because the person who's reading it understands that. It's that sort of thing that sometimes I think we forget exists even within like biblical and extra biblical texts or just ancient texts. We almost read them as if it was written, I don't know, like we expect it to be just what it means and not
the plain reading argument isn't. It's never plain.
Forget that it's not written in it's product of its own environment and time, its own sort of culture and assumptions behind certain words and phrases that people at the time understood, that we now need academics and scholars and that to dig through and pick out. Which is why it annoys me when people get sort of like the anti-intellectual thing of like, oh, you don't need a degree or whatever to preach. I'm like, yeah, you don't, but it definitely helps when you want to really get into proper sort of background of text. And you wouldn't be preaching in English if you didn't have scholars and people translating from Greek. So,
and I think that's being willing to.
I have my hobby horse on that one.
No, it's good. It's good. Good things to think through. I'm very grateful that I was able to preach early on, but it is something that I think, again, the character of the person has to come through. And I'm not saying my character was awesome, therefore I should be allowed to preach early, but the teachability, so are you learning as you go? Are you learning and willing to hear someone go, actually, your sermon there was incorrect because you said X, and actually here's another way of reading it. Preachers aren't going to get everything right every time, but are they willing to examine that?
Priscilla and Aquila come across that guy preaching, they're just like pull him aside and say, actually, you're missing some details here, and say this is how the gospel should be presented. And hopefully people are open and willing to have that sort of correction and teachableness, but not everyone does. Some people shout at you.
Sadly so.
As I've discovered on TikTok recently.
Shouting through the comments.
That guy is spamming me to death now because apparently he's right and everything I say is wrong or whatever. Or I say things that everyone else is wrong because I've said it's right.
Yes. And if you correct them, then you're arrogant. Like there's the default. I think that's the frustrations of social media allows for narcissism and everything being turned on its head. So I guess let's deal with Spartan's question. And Spartan Theology asks for the podcast that won't be seeing the video. Does Luke think some of the church fathers, like Maximus, for example, were universalists?
I mean, he's asked me about a guy I'm not that familiar with, but from a quick search when I saw that question, it reminded me who he is. If it's Max, what's his face? Can't say his name now. Maximus the Confessor, if it's the same guy, then from what I understand, he was seen as maybe softly in favor of that, or I don't know, influenced by Origen. But I don't know enough about him and his teachings to be able to say one way or another. He's not someone I've read that much.
Right. Do you think there were church fathers that were explicitly universalists, where it is like, yeah, definitely they are universalists through and through? I know I always hear Origen come up as that.
Yeah, he gets a bad rep. A lot of the issues with Origen are after his death, and it's actually his followers that sort of took his teachings down a bad route, and then he was condemned post after death.
Post-mortem, is that the one?
Yeah, whatever.
Another word for after death.
Yeah, so he sort of gets made a heretic after death when he can't really defend himself, which is a bit unfair. And
that's a shame.
It's kind of his followers that took his teachings to extremes that really did the disservice, not him.
Okay.
He wrote a lot of sort of open-ended questions, like exploring these sort of things and asking the questions, but he would always make sure to say, this isn't my views, or this isn't what I believe, or this is just questions to pose and think through that he's sort of working out.
Okay.
But careful to make the distinction, this is not the accepted orthodoxy or whatever, that kind of thing. So he was a great thinker, and wrote a lot of stuff and influenced so many other early church that without him, and to sort of write him off as a heretic would be to sort of write off a whole load of other people that we take for granted as being solidly orthodox. So
we do that today, and that's something I think the whole journey through the Hell Project stuff that I've done has actually made me recognize how quick we are as Christians to write off people like Origen as heretics, or like people we should avoid as quickly as possible. I've just clocked the time, so we'll keep this to an hour, and we'll do a part 2 as best we can. But I need to dig into Origen myself. I'm also aware the later writings of Gregory of Nyssa are often recommended by universalists, but I find myself, and as you said, with the distinction between universalism as the sort of all roads lead to heaven, there is no hell of judgment, but universal reconciliation, where there is a judgment, a resurrection, a judgment, and what the judgment brings in through the fires is refinement. I find myself being a lot fairer minded for these other views than I once was, but also I wish other Christians were a bit more fairer minded about it, because I know what it's like to be, you're questioning hell, you're a heretic, because I get that quite regularly. And it's like, well, actually, no, there's some really fascinating church fathers that have wrestled with this. There's some really fascinating history within the church that have wrestled with this. And there are actually some very good thinkers who are wrestling with universal reconciliation that I would be, who are quite clearly love Jesus and follow him and want to hold to the authority of Scripture. So, I do find that question quite interesting. And I think
whatever the sorry,
you go for it. You go for it.
I was going to say, whatever the sort of view, like historically and traditionally, there's always, death, judgment / resurrection, and then some kind of fire is involved, and it's whether that fire torments forever, burns you up to nothingness, or refines you into purity. So
and there's been historically all three.
and they've sort
to
of
some extent.
existed side by side in some times. So that's what I mean. There's never been a sort of official statement of doctrine on hell.
Yeah.
Which is interesting, really. If
until the
it
Baptist
clearly
churches.
wasn't, it clearly wasn't as important of a doctrine as it's made out to be today.
Yeah.
You see what I mean?
Yeah.
And like whenever so it's like goes on about, you know, hell is like the key part of most people's gospel presentation, I'm like, well, go and look through Acts, all the sermons and preaching, and try and find it. It's never mentioned once, which is also telling. Like, if Jesus really did speak about it more than anything else, surely his closest disciples would include it in their sermons in the book
about
of Acts.
Jesus. Yeah.
And they never mention it.
Absolutely. And it is that the two things for me are that how silent the New Testament is, aside from referencing destruction. So like 2 Peter talks about, 2 Peter is often quoted as extinction. The extinction is the example of what happens to the ungodly. It's quite strong, and then Jude kind of echoes that.
Stronger, I think, in Greek than other places.
Yeah, it's probably the strongest part of it that sounds very much like annihilation. And then you've got eternal destruction in Paul's 2 Thessalonians 1:9. But ultimately, if you want to preach on hell, you can and preach eternal torment, you have to pull things out of context. I think one of the things I found was just this
or ignore a bunch of other texts.
But you can't preach it from the Old Testament. So that was one thing I always go to. Now that when I read a traditionalist defense, I always count how many verses are referred to in the Old Testament. And I remember reading Hell Under Fire by a bunch of traditionalist scholars. And in each chapter, the number of times they referenced the Old Testament was generally like, I could count on one hand most
Isaiah,
times.
probably.
Yeah, and even then it was like often they were misquoting a weak argument to then attack it, and it was So anyway, that's a whole nother side. That's not in the Church Fathers. So I realise the time we haven't really actually discussed the Church Fathers as in depth as we'd hoped, but it's been really nice to chat.
I think.
Yeah, hopefully that's been helpful for those of you listening. We're coming up to the hour mark. I'm trying to keep these conversations to an hour, partly because I don't have the stamina for long form podcasts anymore, but also just to keep you interested, and hopefully we'll have another conversation more about the Church Fathers and their views on hell as I engage more with them, and maybe Luke, we can get you back on here again soon.
Yeah.
Any sort of final resources that you can share? I mean, you've got one that you've written, so plug away. Show us your book and
there we go.
Give us some other resources to engage with the Church Fathers.
Here is my book. This is the product of my journey, looking through the early church and everything like that. I wrote basically it's 40 days because it's written in short daily chapters that you can read, like 10, 15 minutes, whatever, if that, and go through roughly 400 years in 40 days. So, and there's also a bunch of other resources in there. I've added like maps and lists of heresies, timelines of like major events alongside the dates of the New Testament and the early text, so you can sort of get a sort of more context of when things were written and what was happening around that time. Some extra text like appendices that are relevant to other parts of the book but aren't like part of it, if you like.
Cool.
If you like maps
always
and
need
stuff.
A good map.
So that's like shows where the New Testament books were written, where the early church texts were written, so overlaid, so you can sort of see where the early communities were forming around these sort of authors or their texts were sent. Another book I'd like to recommend is this one's a good one, Dictionary of Early Christian Beliefs.
Cool.
By David Burcott. I don't know how you say his surname.
Burcott. Okay.
Yeah. or I don't know.
So
but
just
yeah,
for podcast, what? Let me just read that title again, just so the podcast catches it when there's no video.
A dictionary of early Christian beliefs.
Cool. And David Burcott. Is it David?
Yeah. David Burcott. Yeah.
Cool.
So that's like an A to Z of lots of things, and it's full of quotes on every topic you can possibly think of.
Awesome.
Which is quite handy.
I'll try and get a link to those in the show notes as well, so hopefully people can get to them.
I guess Hope of the Early Church, Handbook of Patristic Eschatology, which is more general end times rather than just hell, but hell falls under that sort of eschatological banner.
Cool.
So yeah,
I've added to my book list. And I've actually found your book already really quite helpful in terms of navigating the early church fathers. So I'm taking it slow as I read the church fathers as I engage with your book, but I do recommend it, having already started using it. So thanks for writing it. I'm in the middle of Irenaeus, and I'm finding some of the copy I've got. So it's got short and longer parts to it. And it does seem a bit repetitive, but it's good. There's some good stuff in there, obviously, but there's I think it's the format I've got on Kindle. It's downloaded all of them, so it's like I've been reading for several days, and I'm still at 1%. So I've got it's a bit depressing from that side of things.
Yeah, I'm sure people's attention spans were longer in the old days because, crikey, they really wrote a lot.
They did. Yeah, no, it's good. Do highly recommend getting involved in it. So, Luke, thank you once again. Thanks for joining in and sharing your story and answering questions. And hopefully we'll have you on again and have a bit of a more focused, in-depth discussion about the church fathers and hell, more than what we've done so far. But hey, my first live stream back. We can't have everything all in an hour.
Maybe people can submit some questions or points they'd like, and we can
definitely drill
down on those then.
Absolutely. So, and also follow Luke on TikTok and see all the things he's doing on there. And do you do YouTube?
Yeah, I upload everything from TikTok
from TikTok to YouTube,
and Facebook.
Cool.
Yeah.
What's your channel?
Sacred Faith.
That's right. I have linked to that in the show notes. So the Sacred Faith, and hopefully you'll find some more followers. And cool. We're going to leave it there. So for those of you who have recently joined into the chat, thank you so much for watching live. Thank you for your questions and encouragements. Hopefully, as a sort of start back to live streaming, I hope that's been helpful for you. And do like, subscribe, share, do get in touch. I've got a Substack as well with some articles on there. I'll be updating things about upcoming live streams, people I'm hoping to get on here to chat about the topic. And if there's particular questions you want discussed, and if I can't answer them, I will see if I can find someone to get onto the live stream to answer the bigger questions. Now, Spartan Theology, I have seen you in the chat, and hopefully we can organise a chat as well. We've been talking about it, and my life has freed up enough that hopefully that'll be in the next couple of months to talk about universalism as well, and engage with some of the stronger arguments for that position. So again, thank you, and good night. See you later.
Bye.